just been made a senior associate fellow here at RUSI, so I'm delighted to be comparing this session, but do not intend to dominate the questions to General David Petraeus, because I think there are a lot of people here who would have a lot that they want to say to him. Welcome.
Great to be back.
General David. Very nice indeed to have you here.
Make sure my communications are working here. Are they working? Okay. Look, and thanks just up front, first of all, for what you're now doing with RUSI. More importantly, thanks for your decades of service as a diplomat, national security advisor, ambassador, during which time you did a great deal to ensure the tremendous relationship that our two countries have enjoyed over the years, and of course did it in the past 15 years at a time of war. So thanks. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful to have you back to RUSI. I should just do a couple of housekeeping points, I suppose. I hope people have got mobile phones switched off. If there's any kind of problem, like a fire or something, follow RUSI staff. Do as you're told. It's usually the best answer. And this session with General David is on the record.
This one is.
It is on the record, I think.
Yes.
So,
but I'll tell you up front, there are two topics that will be off limits. One is anything about particular political candidates. The other is why the U.S. Military Academy cannot beat the U.S. Naval Academy in football.
All right. The most sensitive topics are not for discussion.
Far too painful.
General David does not need any introduction from me here. He's very, very well known. I first knew you, General David, when you were commanding the multinational training force in Iraq in the mid-2000s. You then went on, of course, to command in Iraq, to command CENTCOM, to command in Afghanistan, as well as to be director of the CIA, before moving on into another life in which your principal role is as a senior vice president of RUSI. So it is extremely good to have you back here to do that.
And KKR may take some issue with that.
Yeah, but we won't ask them. A real military strategist and thinker, as well as, of course, a major operational commander. No one better to talk about counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. The issues facing the next president is the topic for the discussion. I wondered, General David, whether you might kick off with just something a bit broad about the mood in the US on national security topics. I mean, after these 15 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, where is the country? Where is the center of gravity, do you think, on intervention, standing back? How much involvement is there an appetite for?
I think undoubtedly there are some conflicting emotions. On the one hand, there is a desire to see the Islamic State defeated as quickly as can be managed. On the other hand, there is an examination of Iraq and Afghanistan and how frustrating and costly these endeavors have been. And I think in some respects, the pendulum swung very considerably in one direction, as it always has after significant engagements like that. There was a No More Koreas movement. There was a No More Vietnams. I wrote my dissertation at Princeton, in fact, on the military, the influence of Vietnam on military thinking about the use of force, and it basically made them very, very cautious. And I think that indeed our actions as a country did reflect that, but I think it has now come back somewhat. And I think that you see this most significantly, of course, in Iraq, where there's an authorization now that takes the U.S. troop number up to about 5,200, and people estimate that that's probably 6,000 on the ground on any given day because of how the counting rules work if you're in there for shorter than 30 days, this kind of thing. So that's quite a significant engagement. And then you look at the enormous number of enablers that we have in there as well, the unmanned and manned aerial vehicles, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, precision strike, the intelligence fusion, the advise, assist, train, and equip, and of course with the UK very much in that, as it has been in all of our engagements since 9/11, but also a very, very large coalition that is all endeavoring to defeat the Islamic State.
And I think we should perhaps get into the subject straight away, which I'm sure others will want to ask about, which is what lessons should we be drawing, do you think, from the experience that the US, we and others have had in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 15 years? You were at the center, obviously, of the surge, but before that, in the training, and then afterwards in command. What do you take away from that? What do you think we should be taking away from that as we look at the problems in Syria and Iraq and other places today?
I think there are 5 big ideas, if you will, or 5 lessons. The first is that ungoverned spaces in an area that ranges from North Africa through the Middle East to Central Asia. Ungoverned spaces in that area will be exploited by Islamic extremists. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. Yeah. The second is that Las Vegas rules do not apply in these areas. What happens there does not stay there. Rather, it spews violence, instability, extremism, and in the case of Syria, and even in some cases North Africa, a tsunami of refugees that has flowed into our NATO allies in Europe, into the Schengen zone and so forth, and causing enormous ramifications, but also, of course, being behind the Islamic State-inspired violence, again, in some of our NATO country allies, and indeed, to a degree, in the United States as well. So these are not problems that, as the sometimes say in Washington, you can admire until they go away. They don't go away, and you have to do something about them. In doing something about them, the U.S. has to lead. There's just no alternative. The assets that we can bring to bear, especially I identified these unmanned aerial vehicle, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This is an armada. It's a constellation almost. And over 60 Predator and Reaper lines. That means 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's over a target. Now that means there's multiple of those. It means there's 150 people behind it to enable it each. You can take all of our possible allies and coalition partners together, and I think you would multiply it by many times, and you probably would not get to that number. Beyond that, you have this industrial strength intelligence fusion capability. So again, the U.S. does have to lead, I think. But it shouldn't do it alone. We should do it as a coalition. We obviously want our most valued partners, and of course, there's always been a reason why I stopped in the UK going to and from Iraq and to and from Afghanistan and Central Command. But we also want Islamic partners. Many of our, as you well know from your time as National Security Advisor and other posts, many of the successes that we have had in this overall campaign have involved Muslim partners, Islamic countries, their assets, their soldiers, intelligence services, leaders, and so forth. Then the next lesson is that in exercising this leadership, we have to employ a comprehensive campaign. This is a paradox, if you will, that to counter terrorist elements like the Islamic State requires much more than counterterrorism force operations. And it's obvious that in the case of the Islamic State, it's a veritable army. Yes, there are also guerrilla elements and then terrorist cells that are trying to blow up markets in Baghdad and so forth, as when Sir John Kisley and I were there as 3 stars. But we have to have this comprehensive effort, and it has to be, frankly, all of the elements that we had in the surge in Iraq, but without the U.S. providing all of them. And it's impressive what we are doing there and the way that we've been able to help the Iraqi security forces reconstitute and then enabling them to carry the fight to the Islamic State, taking away Fallujah, Ramadi, all the other cities in the Euphrates River Valley, in Anbar province, and then indeed now moving progressively up the Tigris River Valley all the way through to Crete, up to Kiara, this huge air base into which we're now flowing additional U.S. forces and coalition forces and Iraqis, and gradually encircling Mosul and getting ready to clear that, and then Nainawa province. Those will be the last. There's a Hawija also down in Kirkuk that will have to be dealt with. But this is actually moving along impressively, but it has to be a comprehensive campaign, not just a counterterrorism force operation.
Is it learning the lessons, do you think, of the last 10 or 15 years now, what we're doing there with the Iraqis?
I think we are. I think we, and if you look at all of these, I think, and there's a very important 5th lesson, and that is that this is a generational endeavor. We'll make progress against the Islamic State. We'll likely defeat the Islamic State unquestionably in Iraq, then in Syria, and we'll put a stake through the heart of individual leaders. Adnani, the very important operations chief, is one of the most recent, also now an al-Qaeda affiliate apparently in northern Syria. Ultimately, Baghdadi. You cannot run an army and a caliphate and not at some point end up on the X, as they say. But we can't put a stake through the heart of the ideas, of the ideology, the extremist narrative, if you will, that does attract some individuals and has been used so impressively, if you will, diabolically through cyberspace and on the internet. By the way, that's one reason why we had to, as quickly as possible, show that the Islamic State is a loser, and arguably could have done this faster. This is very, very important because losers don't recruit as well as winners, obviously, on the internet and on social media. So those 5 lessons, again, ungoverned spaces will be exploited, the effects will not be contained, and indeed they have enormous ramifications well beyond the region itself. The U.S. has to lead in response, has to be a comprehensive campaign, should involve a coalition to be sure. And then the 5th is that this is the work of a generation. Now, the reason that last one's important is because that feeds back into, it tells you that the strategy has to be sustainable for a long period of time. And that's where I think what is emerging in Iraq is indeed very impressive. The costs that most weigh on a country are obviously blood and treasure. We have significantly reduced the casualties, compared again with what we experienced when we were there, and also have reduced the cost quite a bit as well, because again, the bulk of the ground force fighting is being done by others. And this will continue to be refined. Just as a side note, I was in Harvard yesterday. I'm a senior fellow there also. And we actually have a project ongoing trying to capture lessons learned on advise and assist missions. So this is different than train and equip, which is pretty straightforward. Actually, it wasn't that straightforward when we were trying to get it started. It was hugely painful. But we know how to do that. That's pretty straightforward compared with advise and assist. And actually getting into the techniques of this, where you can put GPS on the Iraqi forces, get maybe GoPro devices on their antennas or something so you can see what they see. There's a whole series of these kinds of emerging uses of technology that enable us to have a very good sense of what they're doing without actually being forward with them. And by the way, the reason not to be forward with them is not just because we don't want to take risk. That's not it at all. It's actually that Americans, when they're with some foreign units, the soldiers of those units will look right past their leader and look at the Special Forces sergeant to see if he nods his head and says, yeah, that's a good order, you ought to follow it. We have to be very careful not to take over units, which can be easy to do. There is an authorization now that rests with Lieutenant General Steve Townsend, who is the commander of the Combined Joint Task Force that's headquartered in Baghdad, to move advisors forward to battalion level. To my knowledge, that's not been done, with the exception of a couple of counterterrorism force raids. But he does have that authority if he wants to exercise it. Right. And again, these other techniques are factoring into this. It's very, very interesting indeed what has happened. I'd argue that it's almost half a military revolution.
It's very interesting, yeah. And it's taking on what we learned years
very
ago.
much so, yeah, very much so. To be truthful, we could do more of this in Afghanistan. I think it's well known that there were restrictions on the air power there for a while. After our forces were no longer in the front lines, Afghans took very significant casualties, continue to, and those restrictions have been relaxed to a considerable degree, could still be perhaps relaxed a little bit more.
What about applying your template of your 5 lessons to Syria? What advice would that prompt you to give on how the next president should approach Syria?
Well, with respect to Syria, we're actually carrying out some of this. The challenge has been, of course, that it's been too little too late, arguably. I mean, now, again, this is a horrifically challenging situation. It's gotten more and more and more complex. At first it was just Bashar al-Assad's regime forces against the Sunni Arab majority opposition and, to a degree, the Syrian Kurds. And then, of course, Lebanese Hezbollah was introduced, Quds Force advisors from Iran introduced, actually some forces from Iran actually on the ground, Shia militia from the region supported by Iran, and then ultimately, of course, the Russians come in, which adds an enormous additional amount of complexity to it all. We have said, generally, diplomats, your counterparts, have said that there is no military solution to Syria. I am not sure that Bashar al-Assad and Vladimir Putin necessarily embrace that idea. At the very least, they are set on displacing 250,000 plus Syrians from eastern Aleppo right now in a very, very barbaric manner, frankly, bombing hospitals, bombing locations with innocent civilians, and causing enormous death and other casualties. I have felt for some time, and I've said publicly, that a safe zone and a no-fly zone should be very, very seriously considered. That also Bashar al-Assad should have been told a long time ago that if you continue to drop barrel bombs on people's heads, that we will ground your Air Force, which is something that could be done in a fairly straightforward manner with weapons that don't even have to enter the airspace through a variety of cruise missiles for starters. Mm-hmm. And we do have aircraft in the airspace anyway because, of course, they're conducting operations against the Islamic State in northern Syria in particular. Now, that has enormous additional complexity when you have Russian planes in there who could be excluded from that no-fly zone. And so that's a big, and then what kind of question. And I believe, in fact, it is today that actually in the Situation Room of the White House that they are considering these options according to public reports. Mm.
I think I should probably open up the discussion to everybody in the room. I mean, there are many other subjects as well as we go through questions which we can get on to, including NATO, including the handling of Russia and so on. But thank you, David, for a good start. Let's start here, second row. The microphones are circulating, one coming to you there. There we go, sir.
There we go. And you might hand it across to the other.
Yep.
General, if you just give me a second to read my notes. There we are. I put it to you that, I'm John Wilson, I'm a member of the Institute. General, I put it to you that democracies are not good at fighting long wars or insurrections. Therefore, they are at a severe disadvantage to their enemies. What is the solution if the Western democracies are not to face ultimate defeat?
Shall we take another question as well?
Me, actually, at my age, I've got to take one at a time, okay, I'm afraid. Very, very hard, but you can hand it to the man behind there. And then let's hand it over to this individual here who raised his hand.
Very good.
With respect, I would have bought that 10 or 15 years ago, that democracies can't fight long wars. But America is in the process of fighting the longest war in its history in Afghanistan, and it does continue to carry on that campaign. Indeed, a group of former commanders of the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, ambassadors to Afghanistan, and these special representatives for Afghanistan and Pakistan all got together under the auspices of the Brookings Institution in Washington. And on Monday, we unveiled, I was one of them, we unveiled a proposal that, in fact, Afghanistan there should be an enduring commitment by the next administration to Afghanistan to avoid the year-on-year constant analysis and the anxiety, frankly, that creates among our Afghan partners, in some cases among our coalition partners, and it's unhelpful in the region as well if there's not a sense that the U.S. is going to continue it through. But I think the answer to the second part, actually, is really what I was talking about when I went through those lessons. What we have to have are strategies that are sustainable. Sustainable, again, in its broadest of terms, has to do with blood and treasure. And what we are doing in Iraq is really very, very interesting in that regard. When you contrast that we had 165,000 Americans during the surge, we now may have at most 6,000 on the ground at a given time in Iraq, and indeed we're defeating a considerable force. That is quite impressive, and indeed I think the American public is willing to accept that kind of commitment. It obviously has to understand the interests that are at heart. Those have to be clearly explained. And then again, the cost has to be sustainable, and there has to be a sense that this is achievable as well. For what it's worth, when we get into Syria, I think there are some serious challenges in terms of, the military guys like to ask, what is the desired end state? And I'm not sure that what is being described as a desired end state, a federal Syria, still a unitary state, is completely realistic anymore. I fear that the that Syria is Humpty Dumpty and cannot be put back together again. With respect to Afghanistan, again, we strongly believe, the group that I'm part of, there should be an enduring commitment. Again, it shouldn't be all that bigger or smaller, frankly, than what we have there now, although we can use some of the assets, we think, a bit more effectively if some of the still lingering restrictions on air power and so forth are relaxed somewhat. So I think that's how I would answer that question, and I think this is uncharted territory. The United States has certainly never carried on a war this long. We've certainly had enduring commitments, obviously the NATO and the Cold War and troops in North Korea for a very long time, or in the Republic of Korea facing off against North Korea for a very long time. But those were not ones in which we were incurring substantial casualties at all.
Thank you so much for having us today. I'm Saifuddin from Iraqi Embassy. Regarding to the current situation, General, in your opinion, what do you think should be done by the next president of USA to improve the security situation in Iraq, especially that Iraqi military forces are in preparation for al-Mosul battle to push Daesh back? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, shukran jazilan, and great to see you. I'm still, by the way, wanting to have a ration card in Iraq. I thought that my 4 years there would justify that at this point in time, so if you could register that desire still. Look, I think what the next President of the United States has to do is what the President of the United States is doing right now, which is to continue this effort. There will be further refinements to it. There will be augmentation of some aspects of it. Obviously, the defeat of the Islamic State will ultimately involve clearing Raqqa as well, the capital of the Islamic State in Syria, in addition to clearing Mosul. As you may recall, I know Nainawa province and Mosul very well, having spent the first year of the war there. After the fight to Baghdad with the 101st, we then air assaulted north and took over Mosul. And I think the challenge here is actually not the Islamic State. We will defeat the Islamic State. We now meaning the Iraqi forces advised and assisted by the U.S. and the coalition. There's no question about that in my mind. What is going to be far more difficult is going to be the governance of Nainawa province, the capital of which again is Mosul, after Daesh is cleared. This is the most complex human terrain in all of Iraq. Yes, it is a Sunni Arab majority, but there are Shia Arabs, there are Turkmen Shia, there are Turkmen Sunni, there are Shabak, Yazidi, numerous Kurds, and the Kurds have moved all the way down, of course, in the west, all the way out to Sinjar. There are grievances between them. There are grievances within them. Obviously, in the Kurdish regional government, there are 3 different political parties that are experiencing some degree of friction right now. There is friction between Sunni Arab elements. And how this all shakes out is going to be very, very challenging. I know what it takes to establish governance there that is truly representative of all the people and responsive to all of them, and that guarantees not just majority rule but minority rights, because we did establish that in that first year. In fact, we did it very early on in early May of 2003. But I was enabled by 20,000 air assault troopers of the 101st Airborne Division, 254 helicopters, and the authority of an occupying commander under the Geneva Convention. That is not, there's no shake of a tribe with that kind of power right now. Even the Prime Minister obviously has a whole variety of interests that he has to balance and deal with, including those with the Kurdish regional government, but then within the different elements. So this is going to be very, very challenging. And, of course, he is doing that while he's having to watch his back in Baghdad, because there's a parliamentary bloc that has had a vote of no confidence that took down his Minister of Defense in the past 2 weeks, one more recently that took out a very highly respected Kurdish political leader, Hoshar Zebari, the Minister of Finance, who was previously a respected Minister of Foreign Affairs and a great partner from my early years as well. So this is clearly intent and may now go after the Minister of Foreign Affairs is what the rumor is from my sources and contacts back there in the land of the two rivers. So this is very, very serious stuff. It has always been about a struggle for power and resources, and you see that within a province, within a city, Mosul and Nineveh, and you also see it for Iraq writ large. If I could add, though, that one factor that people often overlook, because it's very easy to list the centrifugal forces for Iraq, there is a massive centripetal force that keeps Iraq together, and that is the central distribution of the oil revenues. It's decided by the central government. This is particularly important now for the Sunni Arab provinces because with the Kirkuk oil fields under the control of the Kurdish regional government, the Sunni Arabs have no significant oil production or gas production in the areas that in which they are the majority. So that's particularly significant. And frankly, I think the Kurdish regional government also still needs some of that revenue, even though they have dramatically increased the production of oil in the north.
Very good. Please.
Hi, my name is Ovais Rajput, and I'm a security study researcher. My question is to you about Kashmir situation, because in UK we have around about 3 million British citizens from Kashmiri heritage, and politically we can't ignore the situation in Kashmir. And also right now on top 10 agenda of US commanders, Kashmir is nowhere. So how you see the situation, and B, about international terrorist financing. Majority in Pakistan or in South Asian, my case studies, what I found, whether we talk about Taliban or any radical group, they actually holding the British citizens or European citizens' property in those areas, but we have no legislation. How you can see, how you can comment on that? Because right now, with my more than over 100 interview with people, we really need to do some legislation to combat or to break that terrorist financing.
I'm not sure I understand the legislative issue that is there, and no need to. I mean, what does have to happen and is actually happening is something that, again, we did in Iraq with the multinational force in Iraq when we were at the height of this. We created a counterterrorism financing task force that went after the money. When I talk about a comprehensive campaign, if you think of the good old Anaconda slide that we used to explain to the U.S. Congress why we had to use more than counterterrorist forces to counter terrorism in the form of al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Sunni insurgents. In the center, we had what these groups need, and the same is true of the Islamic State. They need money, they need sanctuary, they need headquarters, command and control, communications, explosives expertise, fighting expertise, and ideology, and so forth. All of that is in here, and recruits, especially for suicide bombers. We then targeted, we tried to squeeze the life out of the al-Qaeda and its Sunni insurgent affiliates by targeting every element in that, and that's why it was called the Anaconda slide. And around the outside, we had all the elements of that, and it was far more than just counterterrorism force operations, conventional clear, hold, and build operations, but all included politics, reconciliation, legislation, rule of law, police detention facilities, and judicial. It included basic service restoration, education, I mean, all of the elements of that you have to, of course, have a security foundation first, but then to solidify and build on that foundation, those are the elements that you have to use. So that's hugely significant. With respect to Kashmir, obviously the loss of life by the Indian soldiers was very, very significant. And I must say that I think Prime Minister Modi has handled this in quite a skillful manner, frankly. He recognizes the significant downsides of a real clash between Pakistani and Indian forces. He knows where that could lead, but he also realized that he had to take action. There had to be some form of counterattack, if you will, of retribution, and targeted these staging areas that were used to indeed push extremists into the Indian-controlled areas. And I think that that has been, again, a fairly skillful move that has gone obviously beyond the kind of rhetoric that has featured in the past in Indian responses, but has not been so escalatory or provocative that it seems to have touched off something that would just continue to build.
Okay, a lot of people are trying to catch my eye. I'm going to go to Frank Gardner of the BBC, the balcony there. Is there a microphone at that end of the room? And then to the gentleman here.
Start shouting, Frank.
Yeah. Frank, I think there's...
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
There's a microphone coming, but...
Thanks very much for that. The stakes in Syria have changed dramatically. Thank you. Microphones changed dramatically too. The stakes in Syria have changed dramatically for the worse since the time when you were in uniform, when it all kicked off back in 2011. So is there now a thinking, do you think, in Washington that there is going to come a point, or the risks coming a point sooner or later, where it's simply not worth it for the US to be continuing on the path that it is? Obviously, there have been huge efforts exerted to get a deal with the Russians, to try to get the ceasefire to hold. But the Russians have moved S-300 air defense systems into Tartus. They've already got an S-400 air defense systems at Latakia. If, as you suggest, there's a no-fly zone, how's that going to be policed if the Russians say, you know what, we're going to still keep flying, and if we want to drop some bombs, we're going to do it?
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, first of all, Frank, obviously the question of the day and of the hour, I think, literally. And the stakes have increased very, very substantially, and the situation has got more and more and more complex and challenging and difficult. And as I said, I have doubts as to whether or not Syria will ever be put back together again. Certainly the vision that is put forward of a unitary Syria, some kind of federal leadership, seems, again, to me to be less and less realistic as this develops. And it's very likely that you will have a rump Syria, and again with Bashar al-Assad trying to ensure that all of Aleppo is included in that, and then an area that's controlled by the Syrian Kurds, and then areas controlled by Sunni Arabs, perhaps of several different elements. The U.S. is clearly committed to the defeat of the Islamic State and also of the formerly Jabhat al-Nusra, now Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, the al-Qaeda affiliate, and indeed just also went after some leadership there. And if there are other, frankly, just flat-out Islamic extremist organizations that are carrying out the kinds of activities that the Islamic State seeks to engage in, then they'll have to be, again, on the X as well. There was a time, certainly, when a no-fly zone or a safe zone certainly would have been far less complex. That ended with the introduction of Russian air power. And when I suggest, though, that we should consider still imposing such operations, I do not do that lightly, and I don't do it provocatively. However, again, the scale of human misery here is extraordinary. This is way beyond the numbers of Srebrenica. It will ultimately exceed the numbers in Rwanda and so on. And at some point, this is going to have to be contained, the activities of Bashar and the Russians. And again, the grounding of Bashar's Air Force is something that could very much be done. This is you crater the runways. And again, I don't say that lightly, but if someone truly does want to create the conditions in which you might actually have something negotiated, it is going to take those kinds of actions. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's commonly said that there's no military solution to this situation. I've always said that that may be true, although, as I mentioned earlier, it's not clear that Russia and Bashar al-Assad buy that. But what I've also said is that there has to be a military context without which there cannot be meaningful negotiations. And the fact is that we have been trying to carry out negotiations in a context that does not provide any real reason for Bashar al-Assad and Vladimir Putin to agree to the kinds of steps that have been in these negotiations.
And it can't be in long-term Russian interest to see the emergence of Sunni Islamist extremist areas so close to their southern borders either.
No, absolutely.
So
and
if
you
they're
know,
thinking long-term, it can't be good for them.
we're not without mutual objectives here.
Yeah.
It's also, of course, not in the long-term interest of Iran, the other outside player who is in there and also funding Bashar and Lebanese Hezbollah and so forth. By the way, I think it's worth pointing out as a pivot back to Iraq that there is some, I think it's credible to say, as my great diplomatic partner during the surge in Iraq, Ryan Crocker, says, that Iran would like to Lebanonize Iraq and that it might use the Shia militia, those that it controls, it supports. Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds forces, had selfies taken with these guys just back from the front lines on a number of occasions. And interestingly, led in some cases by individuals who were in our detention facilities during the surge in Iraq because of their murdering of American soldiers, and now are not only leading these militias, but are actually in the parliament. And they are indeed part of this grouping that has been put together to take down the ministers that have been given votes of no confidence.
Gentleman here, and then the lady there.
Assalamu alaikum, General.
Alaikum salam.
From GED. Well, I'm an Iraqi citizen.
Ana Iraqi.
Oh, no. Okay.
Ana
good to
Maslawi.
Maslawi.
No.
That's why.
No.
That's me, Abu Omar, no Abu Ali. Okay, anyway, General, we're talking about Iran just a minute ago, and you say, I believe you ignore them in Afghanistan, and you sit with them in Baghdad. As an Iraqi citizen, we believe without sitting with the Iranian in Iraq, we never ended our trouble. U.S., they have to think twice, and they find good solution for the Iraqi people and sit with the Iranian in Baghdad and sort it out all our trouble. And you believe, and I heard that from you in Baghdad, without Iranian support, you're not going to be away from this matter. Please, General, I want to ask you a clear question. You left in Iraq when you are in charge. You left the Sahwa, which is your, I don't know if guys, they know which is
Sahwa
Sahwa.
is the awakening.
That's right. You left behind you how many thousand guys, and you just went away. And those guys, most of them, they are in ISIS now. You believe that?
No, I
That's
don't
it.
actually.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
No.
Question.
The Sahwa was the manifestation of the awakening. Which was an outgrowth of reconciliation. One of the big ideas that animated the surge was obviously that we could not kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency, that you have to reconcile with as much of the rank and file of the Sunni insurgent groups as you possibly could. And indeed, we set out to do that. We built on the existing small initiative of reconciliation with the Sheikh out near Ramadi, as you may recall, Abu Risha, and we built that, and then it really created a critical mass of it, and it set off a chain reaction that went up and down the Euphrates River Valley, then ultimately up the Tigris, and then even into neighborhoods in Baghdad. Very, very difficult, understandable reservations about reconciling with Sunni Arabs who had, in some cases, our blood on their hands and Iraqi soldiers' blood on their hands when it came to the Prime Minister, all very understandable. And somewhere around 85,000 or so Sunni Arabs were part of that ultimately. By the way, some of the mythology is we didn't buy them off. We actually didn't even have the authority to pay them for the first 4 or more months of the surge. We had to find a legal reason. We ultimately made the sheikhs of the tribes were security contractors. We put them through a course on how to bid for contracts. They won the contracts, and we contracted for fixed site security in their areas. It worked out beautifully, actually. And ultimately, we did this with about 25,000 or so Shia who had been part of the Shia militia until, of course, we defeated them in the Battle of Basra and in Sadr City, Kadamiyya, and some others. So there are about 103,000 total, majority Sunni, but also a sizable Shia element. I don't believe at all that they all ended up in the Islamic State. I do believe that some undoubtedly did. Some certainly felt alienated by the actions when the arrangements made for them were not honored. There were commitments made to them. They were sustained for a good 3 or more years after the surge was over, and then those arrangements were severed, and the commitments were no longer honored. That was a big deal. That mattered a great deal, and it did a lot to trigger, again, this sense that Baghdad was now part of the problem for the Sunni Arabs rather than part of their solution. With respect to Iran, I think writ large, talking about Iran in the region, I often get the question about the Iranian nuclear agreement. In my view, that agreement has some positive elements and it has some negative elements. And of course, it does not have anything to do with the missile program or malign Iranian activity in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen, and perhaps some of the Gulf states. My view is, again, the positive elements are 99% of the low-enriched uranium is gone, all of the medium-enriched uranium is gone, the plutonium path to a bomb has ended with cement being poured into the reactor core. Over half of the centrifuge is not spinning, and the deeply buried site is a research facility now, and there's a reasonably intrusive set of inspection regimes in place. On the other hand, of course, the downsides, if you will, or the drawbacks, are that it ends in 10 to 15 years, and no one's sure what is going to be negotiated under the Non-Proliferation Treaty Additional Protocol, and Iran could be back into that business then as a result. And then, as I mentioned, none of these other activities are affected by it, although there was probably some hope that with this agreement and with the dialogue that preceded it and the relationships established, that perhaps Iran would curtail some of its more threatening and concerning activities. And that has not been the case, certainly when it comes to the missile testing program and a variety of other activities. My advice for the next administration is pretty straightforward. It would be that the President work with Congress for a statement of national principle, which would be that the United States would never allow Iran to enrich to weapons-grade uranium. Iran has said it would never do this anyway. It doesn't want nuclear weapons, it says, so that shouldn't be an issue with them. And again, this would just be a statement. We would want to very much, obviously, maintain the capabilities that the U.S. Central Command has developed to ensure that it can carry out any contingency plan. A lot of these were done when I was privileged to be the CENTCOM commander from 2008 to 2010. And then also, frankly, I think we have to work harder with our partners and allies in the region for a more concerted effort to counter some of these malign activities, which are causing such enormous concern among our Gulf state partners and our ally in that region as well.
Very good. Madam, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, not a problem at all. Good evening, in general, thank you. I'm Emily Knowles from Remote Control. I wanted to ask a question. It was really fascinating to hear from your own mouth the description of this move from large sort of counterinsurgency campaigns where the States is there delivering all of the different parts of counterinsurgency towards a model of counterterrorism where local partners are delivering some of the things that the U.S.
And can I say something there? I'm sort of,
sure.
But I think it's very important to note that this should not mean at all that I think there was any alternative to what we did do when we did the surge in Iraq and did the surge in Afghanistan. I think those were essential. They were necessary. Without that, Iraq might have gone up in flames. By the way, Syria is a cautionary tale for those who have at various times offered that perhaps Iraq should be allowed to break up into Sunnistan, Kurdistan, and Shiistan. What we are seeing is that taking place in Syria right now. And again, that should give us great pause. I was always asking people who offered that particular idea who would draw the lines on the ground and who would move the people and how the resources for the Sunni Arabs would be provided, and many, many other very significant issues, all of which would be fought over very, very fiercely.
Noted. But I was interested to hear more of your thoughts about the reasons now for this shift. How much is it driven by the lessons learned in Iraq and the need to work through local partners, and how much do you see the constraints of this pendulum swing that you've described about a reluctance to put boots on the ground, constraining the way that the US can operate? And also, given that many of the ungoverned spaces that we're working in now, as you say, don't have the same sort of strong local partners as in Iraq. So what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of this strategy?
I think that certainly some of it is the lessons we've learned, some of it is the experiences we've had, but I think we tend to overlook the fact that we now have over 60 of these lines, as I said, the ability to keep 24, 7 days a week, unblinking eye in the sky. And this provides a capability that's just extraordinary. When we did the fight to Baghdad, I was, again, a division commander of the 101st Airborne Division at the time. The U.S. Army Corps that did the fight up the western side of Iraq, basically into Baghdad, while the Marine-led force took the eastern part of the country with the Brits in the south. That entire Army Corps of 3 divisions with many separate brigades that were very sizable had one Predator flying, I don't know if it was 12 or 18 hours a day, maybe, and we all fought over it, needless to say. Now you have this, again, and I've just mentioned the ones that, to me, matter the most. We have hundreds of other lines of lower flying, less capable, smaller unmanned aerial vehicles that scale all the way down to some very, very small ones. That is a key element in all of this. Secretary Gates and I publicly called for 75 lines of this. And again, the platforms are relatively inexpensive, certainly compared to the new F-35 or some of the great aircraft that we are bringing on. But the cost is these 150 people, highly trained, skilled people who are doing all the tasks that are connected with these systems, and indeed the communications architecture, which is massive. We also had only one wideband TACSAT channel when we did the fight to Baghdad, as I recall, and we all argued over that as well. Think about how much you have to push full motion video all around the world. So this is another extraordinary, and these capabilities have grown because of, frankly, demands we put on the system when we were fighting in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and where these were seen to be increasingly so valuable. We just never had enough of them. You were always allocating shortages, as we say. And so it's that development. It's the industrial strength technology advances that have made this possible. And there's lots of others related to that. Those are the most prominent. And again, I would want to emphasize this, as I've termed it, industrial strength intelligence fusion capability, where you digitize everything. You have very powerful apps, Palantir products as an example, these kinds of things. And we started this during the surge in Iraq because we could not push all the data back to the United States. The pipes weren't big enough. So we built basically what we would now call a cloud computing capability in Baghdad itself and brought the software engineers out there and actually did the apps out there. By the way, they're vastly more productive in Iraq than they were in the United States, where they actually went home for dinner and took weekends and occasionally had a beer at night. None of that was possible in Iraq, so everybody just worked. And it was a great concept.
Yep. Keep it powerful. Right. We're down to the last quarter of an hour, and a lot of people who want to come in, so please, a fairly brief question.
Malcolm Savage. General, what relative concerns do you have as far as the 2 current US presidential candidates are concerned as to their ability to deal with major security challenges?
Yeah, with respect, that's one I'll let go by, as I mentioned up front. I truly am nonpartisan. In the United States, it's publicly known that I have advised candidates from both parties. It's not that I don't have experience with one of the candidates, but obviously.
Right. Please, sir.
General, thanks for your insights today. You may have the same answer to this, but back in May, you did go on the record and say you were concerned about inflammatory political discourse against Muslims and Islam. You said when Western politicians propose blanket discrimination against Islam, they bolster the terrorist propaganda. Since then, a certain Western politician has not backed away from that kind of blanket discrimination.
I think, to be fair to that certain Western politician, that he has modulated it somewhat, and I actually did have a conversation with his daughter Ivanka at a recent gathering, the Charlie Rose weekend in Aspen, and again, I think there is an awareness and a sensitivity to that
Do you think the damage is still being done to Western troops abroad because of the benefits to Islamist propaganda by what he said?
Well, again, what I was getting at there, and it wasn't aimed at actually just one specific by any means. There are others who have engaged in this as well, and it was well known that we had huge challenges when I was the commander in Central Command in Afghanistan because of a preacher down in Florida who was intent on burning Korans, and it unleashed a torrent of violence against Americans. So I think any of that kind of activity is very unhelpful. Some of it can be decidedly unhelpful. But it was the reason that I made the point that we want Islamic partners. Many of our successes have come with Islamic partners. And again, for Muslim countries, this is an existential struggle. They have an even bigger stake in this than we do. This is for the heart of the Muslim world, and it is, again, for them, a clash within a civilization that is far more significant than, frankly, the clash between civilizations, to use Sam Huntington's famous phrase.
Mr. Trump's
No,
done
I think,
enough,
come on,
though.
we'll let somebody else go.
Okay.
Malcolm, I think we should let.
Are you a journalist by any chance? Okay.
Thanks.
I used to do intelligence. You see that? I mean, look. Still got it.
Malcolm.
General David, Malcolm Chalmers from the Institute here.
Yeah.
I wonder whether I could ask you a little bit about Turkey. Some of the most dramatic developments relevant to Iraq and Syria have happened in Turkey over the last few months. We, of course, had that Russian plane shot down. We had the failure of the coup, but the subsequent purging of very large numbers of military officers. And we've had a limited Turkish military intervention in Turkey. And the question I have is both your reflections on how damaged Turkish military capability has been by recent events, the purging of such large numbers of senior officers. But secondly, what prospects there are for strategic alignment between Turkey's objectives in relation to Syria and those of countries such as our own and the United States, because it feels like we have quite different objectives.
Well, obviously, starting in the context, the importance of Turkey really can't be overstated. It's a bridge between East and West. It's the only Islamic country in NATO. It is a very stalwart NATO partner. We have forces at Incirlik and in other locations throughout Turkey. We've helped Turkey in its fight against the PKK. It's publicly known that when I was the commander of the surge, that I actually made the decision to shift one of these lines to support them of predators, which was hugely important for them because, of course, a number of the PKK were in the mountains of northern Iraq and a bit beyond their, again, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities in the kind of scale that you could with the systems that we had. There are very good partnerships there. When I was the director of the CIA, I had a very, very strong relationship with Dr. Hakan Fidan, the head of MIT, of their intelligence service. But clearly what has gone on in recent months and during the state of emergency, which of course has been extended another 3 months, is considerable upheaval, if you will, just because of all of the individuals. I think it's a third of the General Officer Corps, thousands and thousands of police, judges, and numerous others. And then, of course, some that are also journalists that have criticized and so forth. So I think there's a lot of reason to watch very, very carefully, certainly to help them, I think, with very good faith efforts in a variety of different ways. But also, you help friends, and occasionally you might point out something that is of concern that could create long-term challenges as well. I think the strategic alignment is very, very possible. Clearly, Turkey now recognizes the challenges posed by the Islamic State, posed by Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, the al-Qaeda affiliate. It has accommodated the Iraqi Kurds over time. There's actually quite a good relationship between the Prime Minister of the Kurdish regional government and now President Erdogan. Obviously, there are huge concerns about the Syrian Kurds who are, 1 degree of separation from the the PKK, certainly in their assessment, something we have to be very wary about. And we did indeed accommodate and push them back across, or request that they move back across the Euphrates River from where they were at one point in time. Again, I think there is very much an opportunity to further what it is that we are doing with them, and they have now gone into Syria, but they have reestablished the relationship with Russia, which was heavily damaged by the shoot down of the Russian aircraft. And I think that there is a willingness to consider outcomes in Syria now that certainly in the earlier years, Prime Minister Erdogan would not have countenanced. And so again, you have all of this evolution taking place, and I think that's yet one more factor that tends to make me think that it's going to be very difficult to put Syria back together again, that Bashar al-Assad could actually stay on much longer than we might have assessed was the case earlier on. And frankly, I'm not one who believes that he should be pushed out until we have a sense of what would follow him. I mean, Syria could actually get even worse than the already horrific situation. I have no brief for him, I can assure you. I do think he is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of his countrymen, and that it was his violent response to peaceful demonstrations early on that caused this to spiral downward as rapidly as it did. But the reality is, I think, that he or his regime is going to have a leader in Damascus that is going to control a fairly sizable part of the country, even though they cannot extend it farther. Just the sheer logistics, I think, get very difficult. What is going to be very interesting to watch, though, is whether they do try to launch something to Raqqa. There could actually be a race to Raqqa. Now, for them, this will greatly extend their logistics lines. They could get cut off. It would be very high risk. But while we're in the process of building up the forces that presumably will be needed for that, particularly the Sunni Arab forces that will be necessary, given that it's a Sunni Arab majority area. At the end of the day, the Kurds should not go too much farther than an area that they want to control in the end. This could be a very interesting development to watch also.
Very good. Please.
Thanks for having us, General, here. My name is Diva, and I'm intelligence security PhD student. General, you stated
What school?
Sorry?
What school?
Buckingham University.
Terrific.
General, you stated that democracy can't win long wars. And
no, I didn't say that. I actually took issue with
Yes, and
with
Afghanistan is U.S. longest war. What do you think that stops U.S. to win the war in Afghanistan, and whether Pakistan intelligence service, inter-service intelligence, double game could be the main cause of the long war without outcome? And B, why U.S. is not taking any actions against Pakistan ISI's continuous killing and supporting terrorist groups? Thank you.
Sure. First of all, I'm not sure that some of these wars in which we've been engaged actually are the kind of wars where you just sort of win, you take the hill. You know, we're not Lieutenant Kisley going up the hill and what hill was that, John? Tumble down hill, and you plant the flag, and you know the enemy collapses, and you go home to a victory parade. I'm not sure that is. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not. And the complication in Afghanistan, as I stated actually before going to Afghanistan, even when I was still the Central Command commander, much less when I did my confirmation hearing, I said we would not be able to flip Afghanistan the way we did actually flip Iraq. I did believe we could do in Iraq what we did. What I never knew initially was whether we could do it quickly enough to satisfy those who were waiting for us on Capitol Hill for that very emotional hearing that we went through 6 months into the surge. Ultimately, we did do that. We had sufficiently demonstrable progress to show violence was down, I forget, 40 or 50 or more percent, even in that period of time, and went down another 40 or so to something like 85% at the end of the surge. And that was done because we really knew what we needed to do. By the way, the surge that mattered most was the surge of ideas. It was not the surge of forces. And it was these ideas were 180 degrees different from what we were doing all the way through 2006 until the beginning of the surge. And they were also completely contrary to what President Bush and Prime Minister Maliki agreed to accelerate doing at their meeting in Amman, Jordan in late November of 2006, something I hadn't realized until the National Security Advisor of Iraq confronted me over this. And I said that if they wanted to continue to do that, they would do it without me, because I would be on the next plane to Washington and intended to take the policy with me. Instead, what we did is, instead of consolidating on big bases, which is what we'd been doing, we went back into the neighborhoods. It's the only way to secure the people. You have to live with them to secure them. We aggressively conducted reconciliation. We stopped releasing detainees until we had a rehabilitation program and got the extremists out of the midst and put them in high security. We stopped transitioning to the Iraqis. In fact, we actually retook control when we went back into the neighborhoods. This was 77 additional locations just in Baghdad, to give you a sense of the magnitude of what we ended up doing during the surge. And again, it was the change in strategy that did that. And I really did believe that we could, in fact, do what we did in a sense in flipping the country in terms of so dramatically reducing the violence. I stated up front we would not be able to do that in Afghanistan. Our mission in Afghanistan, in fact, as it was given to me and as I saw it for the surge, was to halt the momentum of the Taliban, because they were on the move, to reverse it in a number of really key places, including Helmand Province, of course, where the British forces were, and where it's painful to see now what has happened in the erosion of security there, but also in Kandahar and some other places, to roll that back, to accelerate the training and development of the Afghan forces, and to begin transitioning tasks to them and to certain Afghan institutions, with the overarching mission always being to ensure that Afghanistan was never again a sanctuary for transnational extremists, as it was when al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks on Afghan soil under Taliban rule, and the initial training of the attackers was conducted there as well. And by the way, that mission does continue to be accomplished, but it's one, again, that you just can't say it's done and leave. As we have seen, it's going to take a very enduring commitment. The difference in Afghanistan was this issue of sanctuary. The fact is that the Taliban leadership, and indeed some of their support facilities and everything else, the Afghan Taliban are in the Baluchistan area, and of course it was in that rough area that Mullah Mansour, the head of the Taliban, was killed, as was publicly acknowledged by the United States with the strike. The Haqqani Taliban or Haqqani network in North Waziristan, the remnants of al-Qaeda senior leadership presumably in North Waziristan, although Osama bin Laden was in a more built-up area. The Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, a number of other groups, all in that federally administered tribal areas. And those are, frankly, mostly beyond the reach of coalition forces and the regional counterterrorism campaign, although not entirely, as is, again, obviously known. This is a huge challenge, and it is a big conundrum. I was never as convinced as some journalists are that the Inter-Services Intelligence Organization, my counterpart when I was the director of the CIA, and an individual with whom I had a relationship when I was at CENTCOM and in Afghanistan as well as obviously the Chief of Army Staff. I was never convinced that there was as explicit support as some have alleged is the case. It's a very difficult situation to try to understand. There's no question about communication between ISI and some of these groups, but some of that is actually what you would do if you're an intelligence service anyway. Others of it is a degree of accommodation that is, I think, just forced on the Pakistanis because of some limits of their forces. And the reason I think that is because in 2009, there was actually a very impressive campaign by the Pakistani army. This is when the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, was threatening, actually like a dagger pointed at Islamabad from Swat Valley. They'd taken over Swat. And General Kiani directed a campaign that went into Swat, very impressive operations. Then did Baijur Momand, then Khyber, then Orakzai, then most of South Waziristan, and started closing in on North Waziristan with the sense that you just keep restricting the areas in which they might be, which has some benefits for the regional counterterrorism campaign. And frankly, I think it just ran out of, it culminated is the military term. The casualties were very, very high. They do not have this constellation of ISR platforms. There was some assistance to them in various ways that was quite significant, in fact, but ultimately had to be withdrawn at their request when WikiLeaks came out. Bob Woodward's book had unkind revelations, and then the Raymond Davis affair, the contractor for the CIA who killed 2 Pakistanis in a city. And the wheels came off that bus, and that was really tragic because there was an enormous degree of cooperation that was ongoing. That was when I was at U.S. Central Command. And again, I looked very, very hard then, and obviously when I was the director of the CIA and in Afghanistan, to try to understand the nature of the relationship between ISI, between the Pakistani Army, the Frontier Corps, and these groups that were in the Fatah and in Baluchistan. And I think some of it is frankly just beyond the capability of the Pakistani Army, unless they want to end up with something that is a Baluchi insurrection, or unless they want to have all their lines of communication to the border posts cut in the Fatah, on and on and on, issues like that. So this is a fairly lengthy answer because this is a much more murky situation than certain journalists make it out to be. And I've actually talked to them and asked them what their sources of information are, and not really been able to come to grips with that based on all that I knew from, again, these different positions. So, you know, some people have said, they say that Pakistan is a frenemy. It's both a friend and it is a friend in many respects. There are coordinated activities that take place. There are activities that are allowed. But then that there are some actions that seem to cast it as an enemy as well. Again, some of that, the accommodations made perhaps, or perhaps assistance provided to some of those who are blowing up our soldiers and Afghan security forces and civilians in Afghanistan. And again, it is just very, very difficult to pin that down, and it's even more difficult, frankly, to figure out how to exert leverage that could actually, in a meaningful way, resolve the issue. Let's remember that there was a period where we cut all assistance and ties, even held up the F-16s that we were supposed to deliver for quite a number of years. And frankly, that did not help our influence in the country much, shall we say. And it was not until after 9/11 that all of a sudden this all came back together. Very tough situation, and I think it may be among the top 2 or 3 most challenging situations that the new administration is going to face. Right up there, obviously, with the complexities that distinguish Syria.
General David, time has run out on us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
what
Ambassador
struck me,
Peter.
part that you are actually a tremendous diplomat as well. You managed to avoid making any comment on the US presidential campaign, and well done for that. But I think the way that you are continuing to think strategically about the lessons that came out of that period in Iraq and the surge, how the military instrument can work in the constantly evolving situation of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, Syria presenting a rather different case from Iraq, constantly helping us to think about applying the lessons of the past to the present. I thought it was a masterclass. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us here.
I thank you. Thank you.